browser storage feature is a very powerful feature that exists in almost all of our listeners. It allows you to write rules that either capture or store specific values in the user's browser using cookies, local storage, or session storage. Now, this can be very useful if you need to grab onto a user characteristic from their activities and keep that in the browser for a certain period of time and then access it using a solution like Tag Manager. The first step is to define global browser variables that are then going to be available to all of your different listeners. So here you can see we have a session storage key for test user. And then we have 3 keys that are related to campaign codes, and those are set as cookies. In this case, we have one which is intended to store the first campaign code a user visits a website from or with. This one is their most recent campaign code. And then we can also store the entire path of the various campaign codes that they have visited the website using. So if we jump into a form listener, we can take a look at an example browser rule that has been created. In this case, our condition requires that we have an actual form submission occur. And we're looking at a specific field in our forms that we have called user email. What we're looking for is for this email address field to contain the word test. So effectively, we're writing a rule so that when our team goes in and tests forms, if they include the string test inside of the email field, then we can actually do something with that. In this case, what we're going to do is we're going to set the value of the session storage key that we created, test user, to something specific. In this case, we're going to set it as test form. And if we want to get fancy, we can actually include some additional information from the form submission or from our data layer. So here I'm inserting the actual form identifier. And rather than adding the value to an existing chain of values, we're just going to completely overwrite the value that might be in this session key called test user. Now, it's important to note when I was looking at these rules here, you can see this field has been renamed user email, whereas all these other fields from the form look very complicated. If you look inside your variables, a form listener or any listener is going to collect structured data from whatever tool it's monitoring. So in this case, this listener is monitoring a form system. And what it does is it's going to collect all the characteristics of those forms and it's going to put those variables inside here. And so you can actually rename certain values. Here I've taken the actual value of the email input and I've changed the name of it because this makes it a lot easier for me to find it when I am writing custom values or custom rules. So let's, before we jump to our website, take a look at a similar rule that we've written using the URL parameters listener. This listener captures parameters from your URLs and makes them available to write rules in the data layer. So in this case, we want to ensure that we have some URL parameters. The event actually exists in the data layer. And we're looking for a specific parameter called test. We want that to contain the value 1. And in this case, we're going to set the key for test user to the value test user. And again, if we want to get fancy, we could also include something like the href, which would be the actual location the user has visited. So what we've done here is we've set up a couple rules to help track test users and form submissions. As we store this information in the data layer when our team is testing the website, we can then grab onto that in Google Tag Manager and decide what to do with it. For example, here we have a user who has visited the site with a parameter test equals 1. And so you can see our URL parameters listener has grabbed onto that, and it's pushed an event into the data layer, including some automatic values and the fact that it saw a URL parameter test with the value 1. This should match the rule that we created. And as a result, you can see now in our session storage, we have a key called test user, and the value test user pipe, and then the actual href that the user visited has been pushed into the session storage and can be persisted across the session and used in various ways. This is extremely powerful because data layers do not persist in the same way as session storage or local storage. So let's take our second example here, where we also wanted to push a specific value if a user fills out a form and includes test in the form submission. So what we see here is that rule has now overwritten the value in our session storage. So now we are relying on the rule that we first looked at inside of Pardot Forms. As you can tell, browser storage behaves fairly similar to how the custom values and rules can be written in your data layer. So if you're familiar with that, that might make it a little bit easier to configure this. But I want to take a moment here and set up a more complicated rule using browser storage. What we're going to do in this case is we're actually going to store the user's campaign code into a cookie. We're going to first create a rule called campaign code recent. We're going to look for the URL parameter event. And when that's true, we're going to also look for a variable. But it's important to note, if my variable doesn't exist yet because my website has not seen it, I actually need to ensure that the listener picks up on that variable at least once. Let's say I use a parameter called campaign underscore code. Although the underscore is likely not recommended. Let's change it to a hyphen. And let's say I have various campaign codes that I use across my marketing efforts. What we're going to see here is inside of our parameters now, our listener has collected those two values. And I'm going to make this one a little easier to find. I'm just going to rename it CC. And then I'm going to save it. And now I'm going to navigate back to my browser storage, and I'm going to recreate my rule. We're going to save the user's most recent campaign code. So again, we want this URL parameter event to be true. And then we're going to look for that variable called CC. Now it's right here, but you can also type a value into here to filter down the list. And I want this to exist with any value. As long as I have the URL parameter here with any value in it, then I would like to set a value, and I'm going to store this in the recent campaign code. If the key has an existing value, I want to overwrite that existing value. And this will allow me to actually store the most recent campaign code only. And in this case, I actually want the value of the campaign code to be pushed into that. And cookies are starting to have a limited lifetime, so maybe I'll only save this for 7 days. You can also save it into local storage, and you can grab onto this from inside of Google Tag Manager and do something else with it, like send it to another analytics platform. So now I have my most recent campaign code rule set up. And now we're going to create a campaign code path. So in this case, we are again going to look for the URL parameter. And we're going to want to make sure that our variable CC is existing. Once that's done, we're going to set a value. And we're going to put it in the path. And in this case, instead of overwriting the existing value, we're going to add the new value to the existing value in a comma delimited format. Once we have our rules, we are going to go ahead and publish it. After publishing, it's a good idea to do a hard refresh, just to kind of reset the scripts that we're pulling in. And in this case, you can see we've actually loaded the campaign code activity here. And you can see our recent campaign code cookie has a 500 in it, and our path campaign cookie has a 500 as well. Let's say the visitor then comes to the website with campaign code 650. Let's see how that behaves. Now our most recent campaign code is 650, and our path is 500, 650. Now in the console, we can see that all of this information is coming from our data layer event URL parameters. We haven't written custom values, so all of this is coming just specifically from the automatic value. And you can see that campaign code has been captured into the data layer. And then ListenLayer effectively writes the information to the cookie or to the local storage based on the rules that you have created. One important note when working on multiple rules within a single listener. ListenLayer will read these rules from top to bottom. And so you can actually drag and drop them and then save the order. As the system reads from top to bottom, as soon as a match is found for a given variable, it will not be overwritten with a match that exists further down. There's a lot of use cases for browser storage. Please let us know if you find some awesome use cases that you want us to highlight, and we'd love to make a video about it.